Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my presentation of my trilogy, The Boy Generals, George Custer, Wesley Merritt, and the Cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. Although a history of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, it was really not my intention to write a history book per se. What I wanted to do was to write a human story. And to that extent, I have two protagonists. I have George Custer and Wesley Merritt. By the end of the war, they had reached a relationship where they had just detested each other. So for the purposes of this presentation, and in order to illustrate just how rapidly their dysfunctional relationship deteriorated, I am going to talk about three separate incidents. One of them is in the first volume, and then I am going to go to a couple of other volumes. Let me give you a rundown on the volumes. Volume 1 covers the time period between Custer and Merritt's tenures at West Point and continues on through the cavalry fights on the third day of Gettysburg. Volume 2 covers the pursuit of Lee as he retreats towards the Potomac and includes the Bristow campaign, the Overland campaign, with particular emphasis on the Yellow Tavern fight, and ends with the first couple of months of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. And this is a picture of volume 2, which is now has been completed and will soon enter the editing process and publication. And volume 3 covers the period at the end of the Shenandoah Valley campaign and follows through to Appomattox and maybe a few months after the end of the war. I call this the battle for the soul of the cavalry. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. cavalry was really using the European model, which included the hussars, the dragoons, and the heavy cavalry. At the beginning of the war, the Department of War made the decision to get rid of the terms dragoon, hussar, put everything together as cavalry. That does not mean that dragoon and hussars were eliminated from the lexicon of the Civil War. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on several incidents that impact on it. First of all, we're going to cover the Battle of Brandy Station, which is in volume 1. Then we're going to go to Custer's destruction of Beaver Dam Station during Sheridan's raid to Richmond. And finally, we're going to end up at Trevillian Station, where their dysfunctional relationship really comes out into the open. Before moving on, I do want to mention the cover art of the artist, Bruce K. Laws. He has committed to doing all three covers of my book, and he is just a spectacular artist. I've had several Zoom presentations and attended a couple of book signings, and the question I'm asked the most is, who was Wesley Merritt? And how do we know that there was a bitter enmity between Custer and Merritt? And that's what I call the battle for the soul of the cavalry. Custer was probably the ultimate hussar. He loved nothing more than to draw his saber and charge full tilt at the enemy. Merritt trained as a dragoon. He was a solid soldier, quite content to let the dictates of the battlefield determine what his mode of attack would be. If a mounted charge was called for, he would deliver it. If it called for his men to be dismounted and act on foot, and he was perfectly willing to do that. As the war progressed, Merritt turned more and more to fighting on foot. One of the things about this battle for the soul of the cavalry was that Custer was always rankled by the fact that Merritt was always his superior. And Custer, being the kind of guy that he was, he always felt that his many victories and achievements made him a better soldier than Merritt. And he was always distressed by the fact that Merritt did maintain superiority throughout the war. In writing about these two guys, Merritt and Custer, I was faced with two problems, or two challenges, I should say. The first was I needed to debunk a lot of the mythology that has grown up around Custer. For example, in many of the history books, we read the fact that Custer captured the first set of colors for the Army of the Potomac, and that is totally incorrect. The first set of colors taken from the Confederate Army was the flag of the 5th North Carolina Infantry, and it was taken by the 5th Wisconsin Regiment of Hancock's command. I think many of you are familiar with that old saying that we need to study the past in order to define the future. And in this case, what we're actually going to do is we're going to work backwards from the future to the past. And what I mean by that is we're going to turn to Elizabeth Bacon Custer in the aftermath of Custer's death at the Little Bighorn. Libby was quite shocked to find out that a committee had been formed to erect a statue of Custer at West Point. And she was particularly shocked by the fact that she wasn't even consulted in the process. To her friends, she would say that in the depiction of Custer, that he was armed like a desperado. In addition, she was further upset by the fact that notices were published in newspapers by professional military men who were derogatory of the Custer portrayal. So she would spend quite a bit of time trying to get the statue of Custer removed from West Point. At one point, she wrote to General William T. Sherman, who at that point was commander of the U.S. Army. And she wrote, "Years ago, I knew, not from my husband, that General Merritt was his enemy. On the plains, we entertained him, and he seemed to have conquered his enmity and jealousy that was so bitter in the Army of the Potomac. But when he was placed at the head of the court of inquiry that sat to investigate Colonel Reno's conduct at Chicago, I saw how General Merritt still felt toward his dead comrade." She persisted in her efforts, and finally, in 1884, the statue was taken down, crated, and stored in a warehouse, and it has never been since seen. All of which brings us back to the past and the tenure of the two men at West Point. Wesley Merritt was a graduate from the class of 1860. His was the only class that encompassed 5 terms in the entire history of West Point. And that was at the instigation of then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would then go on to become President of the Confederacy. At the time of Merritt's tenure, West Point was under the auspices of the Department of Engineering, and the curriculum was stressed heavily on mathematics and engineering. Davis felt that this was not training for a soldier, and he instituted that 5th course. George Custer graduated from the West Point in the class of 1861. The fact that he graduated at all was a miracle. Throughout his tenure at the point, he flirted continuously with a number of demerits that were required for expulsion, which at that time was 100 demerits. In 1 year, he reached 99 demerits and managed throughout the rest of the term not to get a single demerit. He really screwed things up in the last weeks of his 4-year term when he was acting as officer of the guard and the new cadets were arriving on campus. 2 of the cadets got into a fight, and ignoring his duty as officer of the guard and in charge of keeping the peace of the academy, he not only encouraged the fight, he instigated it. He said, "Let there be a fair fight, boys." Well, he was arrested for that infraction, court-martialed, and it looked like his career as a military officer was over. Luckily, at that time, the Civil War was just starting, and the need for trained officers was very needed. And he managed to get his commission as a lieutenant and proceeded to Washington, where he would participate in the Battle of Bull Run. Merritt, in the meantime, received his commission and was assigned to the 2nd U.S. Dragoons, who were stationed on the Utah frontier, and assigned to the Company B of captain at that time, John Buford, who would go on to become one of his mentors. This picture shows Custer during his tenure on the staff of the topographical engineers during the Peninsula Campaign. And as you can see from the picture, there's wine bottles and liquor bottles and empty glasses all over the place. By this time, Custer had established a reputation as quite a bit of a drunkard. And having served under General Phil Kearny, he was also one heck of a cursor. Part of the Custer mythology is that one day while on leave in Monroe, Michigan, he had gotten quite inebriated, telling old war stories with his fellow soldiers. And in that condition, he had passed by the house of Elizabeth Cliff Bacon, and under the eyes of her father, Judge Bacon. Part of that mythology says that that night, Custer swore up and down to his sister that he would never drink again, and he never did. The cursing part, well, that took a little bit longer, and it wasn't until midway through the Shenandoah Valley campaign that he finally wrote to Libby saying that this was the first battle that he had not sworn at all. Shortly after the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Joseph Hooker relieved General Stoneman of his command of the Cavalry Corps and appointed Alfred Pleasanton to take his place. And in short order, Pleasanton appointed Custer and Wesley Merritt to serve on his staff. Merritt didn't last too long. And in fact, he only lasted 2 weeks on Pleasanton's staff. There were several reasons for that. The first was the choice of mentors between Custer and Merritt. Merritt loved his commander from the 2nd U.S. Dragoons, General, at that time, Philip St. George Cooke, while Custer's mentor was McClellan. In the aftermath of the Battle of Gaines' Mill, McClellan was instrumental in the ruination of St. George Cooke's career, and Merritt never forgave and never forgot the fact that it was McClellan that had been instrumental. Another thing that rankled Merritt was Custer's association with Southern gentlemen who attended West Point. Among them, we find Gimlet Lee, we find James Washington, we find Thomas Rosser, and Stephen Ramseur. Merritt could never forgive the treasonous act of these men when they resigned their commissions at West Point and joined the Confederate Army. And by the same token, he never forgave Custer for the fact that Custer was friends with these Confederate traitors. In the end, their dysfunctional relationship could be traced to something as simple as the fact of a sense of humor. Whether Merritt ever had a sense of humor is debatable. He considered Custer to be too gregarious, and words such as obstinate and insufferable were words that were used in reference to Custer. At the end of 2 weeks, Merritt seeks a command to a field unit and is assigned to Buford's division and in command of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which was really an offshoot, which was the name given to the 2nd U.S. Dragoons after they were all joined together as cavalry. That brings us to our second item that I mentioned about the deterioration of their relationship, and that was the Battle of Brandy Station. Custer was accompanied across Beverly Ford by a bugler named Joseph Fott. His memoirs are in the Marguerite Merrington collection at the New York City Library and is heavily redacted. But there is enough there to show how things started to go bad between Custer and Merritt. After they had crossed over Beverly Ford, Buford moved south and tried to attack or led a charge against the Confederate positions at the old St. James Church. And unfortunately, that charge was a failure. The Union advance towards the position at old St. James was led by General William Grimes Davis. He was ahead of his troops when suddenly a Confederate soldier jumped out from behind a tree and shot him dead. And here we go again to the Custer mythology and how sometimes it just needs to be completely debunked. In 1959, Jay Monahan, in his book Custer, The Life of George Armstrong Custer, said the immediate command devolved on Custer. This was followed in 1967 by D.A. Kingsley, who was not one of the most reputable of Custer's biography. And Kingsley would say that Davis turned command over to Custer, understanding that the young man was about to be tested for bigger things. All of this was finally debunked in 1996 by historian Jeffrey Ward, who said, other historians have repeated the story, but it is inaccurate. Custer's job as a staff officer for Pleasanton was to report back to Pleasanton and inform him of the fact that the man that was leading the move down the road towards the Confederate positions was dead. And that's what he did. So all this other stuff about him leading the charge against the Confederates and stuff is all part of what needs to be debunked as part of the Custer mythology. So Buford moves to attack the rebel batteries at Old St. James Church. And in his account, Joseph Fott says, the next move was of the cavalry, Colonel Merritt's regiment. Custer and I had the lead. Well, Buford's charge failed, and he begins to move the bulk of his command to the right flank. Did Custer have the lead? Merritt was a bit of a martinet, and it's really doubtful that he would allow Custer to get ahead of him and lead the charge of his regiment against the Confederates. So it's more than likely that during the move to the right flank by Buford's men, he and Custer had words. So when they finally get to the right flank, Buford orders Merritt to attack the Confederates on U Ridge. And a couple of infantry officers whose regiments had accompanied Buford mentioned the fact that Custer was present at that point. In fact, one of them said Custer showed much interest and evidently would have enjoyed going with us. But Merritt finally heads towards U Ridge and Custer does not go. So the question then is, was Custer ordered to stay behind at Merritt's instigation? If so, this would be a further indication of just how rocky their relationship was starting to get. And on the pictures we have here at the top, we have Buford's charge against the rebel lines. And at the bottom is Merritt getting into it with, some people say it was Wade Hampton's, others say that it was Rooney Lee. But this is the fight at U Ridge that Merritt participated in. On June 28th of 1863, Shortly after the Aldie, Middleburg, Upperville campaign, headquarters of the Army of the Potomac issued the orders promoting Custer, Merritt, and Elon Farnsworth from captain to brigadier generals. Merritt receives command of the Reserve Brigade of Buford's 1st Division. Custer receives command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, and unfortunately, Elon Farnsworth was killed at Gettysburg, and he kind of departs our story. So let's talk real quick about Custer's luck. What was Custer's luck? Because it was famous throughout the Army of the Potomac. So was Custer's luck to be assigned to General George McClellan's staff? The answer to that would be no. Was Custer's luck to be posted to Major General Alfred Pleasanton's Cavalry Corps staff? Again, the answer to that is no. Was Custer's luck to participate in over 80 charges during the war and only be wounded once? No. The real answer is that Custer was assigned to command the only 2 regiments in the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac that were equipped with a Spencer repeating rifle. And being the only regiment armed with that repeating rifle, they became the core of Custer's tactical philosophy. Now, am I saying that Custer was a tactical genius? No, I'm not saying that at all. But he was clever enough to use the weapons at his disposal and form it into a cohesive tactical philosophy that he would build on throughout the war. At its basic, it was something that was said by another great general during World War II, and that was hold him by the nose and kick him in the butt. And that was the basics of Custer's tactics. He would use the Spencer repeating rifle to hold the Confederates in their front, while he would move around to the flank and deliver a mounted charge on the unprotected side of the Confederate Army. So then we move on to the other point, which was during Sheridan's raid to Richmond. And at one point, Sheridan moves to the rear of his column to supervise the deployment of his rear guard and leaves Custer at the front of a 13-mile-long column of cavalry. And Custer decides he's going to head over and he's going to attack Beaver Dam Station. And there he finds several trains loaded with supplies for Lee's army. And that consisted of flour, meal, sugar, molasses, liquors, and other supplies that Custer figured totaled several $1 million worth of supplies. Of course, Merritt took umbrage at the destruction that Custer had caused. At that time, as the column had moved out, the men were only issued scant supplies for themselves and for their horses, and the bulk of their load was ammunition. So, of course, Merritt gets upset at the destruction that Custer caused and called it gaucherie, which lost us some of the hard day's march. That's a funny word to use, gaucherie. Sheridan, on the other hand, was quite happy. He reported that Custer destroyed from 8 to 10 miles of telegraph, wire, and railroads. And on the top picture, we see the attack on Beaver Dam Station by Custer's men. And in the bottom, we see the method that was used to destroy the railroads. The ties soaked in creosote were piled one on top of the other and set on fire. And then the rails were laid on top until they became soft enough for the men to take them and wrap them around the tree, and they were no longer usable. And that brings us to the third incident, probably the most damning of the 3 that we've talked about. And that's the Battle of Trevilian Station. There was 2 movements by the cavalry, which at this time was under the command of A.T.A. Torbert. And one was Merritt's Reserve Brigade, because by that time Buford was dead and gone, and Merritt had been given command of the Reserve Brigade. And he moves down the Fredericksburg Road, which, as you can see from the picture on the bottom left, was tree line on both sides. Now, this is a modern photograph, and at that time, not only was there extensive timber and trees, but there was also brambles, heavy underbrush, and it made the forward movement of Merritt's men very difficult. As the two sides near each other, they gave up on the use of their long arms, turned to pistols, and finally it turned into a saber fight. And Merritt fell behind on his time schedule. Custer, in the meantime, is moving down towards the Gordonsville Road, which parallels the Virginia Central Railroad along the Nuns Creek Road. And when he comes out on the Gordonsville Road, he finds out that Torbert was acting under faulty information. He had no maps, and the residents of the area were not willing to help the Yankees in any way, shape, or form. So Custer finds that he is 700 yards from Trevillian Station. So he starts moving towards Trevillian, towards the railroad station, and finds that he is in rear of Wade Hampton's Confederate cavalry. The area is chock full of wagons, caissons for the artillery, and led horses for Hampton's dismounted men who are fighting Merritt on the Fredericksburg Road. In no time at all, Custer finds himself completely surrounded by the Confederates. Fitzhugh Lee is attacking from the Louisa Courthouse and attacks his rear and left flank. Thomas Rosser brings his men and attacks Custer from the front, and Hampton finally sends the Butler's Brigade to attack him from the south. So in no time at all, Custer is completely surrounded. In the melee that followed, Custer participated in several mounted charges. And in the process, he was hit by several spent bullets, one of which he hit him in the head and stunned him for several moments. Custer's command is just fighting for its life, and his personal wagon with all of his uniforms, his commission, and most importantly, his love letters from Libby Custer are all captured by the Confederates. And Libby's letters are, to say the least, a little bit on the risque side. They would become fodder for the Confederate press and would be read at parties throughout the South. And Custer was obviously very upset. Custer blames Merritt for the problems that befell his brigade being almost annihilated. And finally, on the second day of the Battle of Trevilian, Custer and Merritt attacked the Confederates, who are hidden behind an embankment of a railroad. And Merritt makes seven total attempts to charge the Confederates, and each time he is repulsed. And he blames Custer for not participating fully in the attack. The possibility exists that Custer was, when he tells Libby that he was stunned by the bullet to the head, is possible that he suffered a concussion. And maybe he just wasn't himself on June 12th, on the second day of the battle. In Custer's official report, he states, "Disappointed at not meeting the other brigades of the division with which I expected to form a junction at this point, and the enemy having shown himself in heavy force on all sides, I was compelled to take up a position near the station from which I could resist the enemy." In a more personal letter to Libby Custer, he says, I carried out the instructions to the letter, but the others were 3 hours behind time. Merritt took a completely different view. He says it was slow work, however, and as the enemy was not pressed on the left, meaning he was not pressed by Custer's Michigan Brigade, he concentrated his force on the brigade. This day, the loss of the brigade was heavy for the numbers engaged. And again, he states the general advance was not made, clearly pointing a finger at Custer. J.H. Kidd, who was in Custer's 6th Michigan Cavalry, came to Custer's defense and says, General Merritt in his report intimates that he had to do more than his share of fighting, that when the reserve brigade advanced to the assault on the right, it was supposed that the attack would be pressed on the left, that it was not so pressed, and that his brigade suffered unduly on that account. And there it is, finally. The split between Custer and Merritt is finally out in the open. It appears in the official records, it appears in several accounts, and it appears in the letters that Custer wrote to Libby. So the dysfunctional relationship has turned from a spirited rivalry to a bitter enmity. And that concludes my presentation, and I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have.